Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey to the highest point in all of Tamriel, to the cracked stone of a mountain that remembers a war older than the kingdoms beneath it, to listen to the voice of a creature who chose once, a very long time ago, to stop being what he was made to be. His name is Paarthurnax, and before tonight is through, you will know exactly what that choice cost him, and exactly what it still asks of anyone brave enough to climb that mountain and listen. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The brother of the World Eater, before there was a Skyrim to defend, before there was a throat of the world, with a path cut into it by mortal feet, there was only sky, and in that sky there were dragons, not metaphorical ones, not the kind that live only in songs sung by firelight. Those songs would come later, plenty of them, sung badly by drunk men in taverns who never once climbed higher than a hayloft. These were Dov, the dragons, ancient and vast, creatures who did not merely fly above the world, but who, by the oldest accounts, helped speak it into being. In the cosmology, the game lets you piece together through dusty books and the bitter testimony of a mountain hermit. The dragons were the first children of Akatosh, shaped from time itself, immortal, contemptuous of anything that wasn't. There's a reason the language of the Dove turns up everywhere in this story, woven into names and titles long before the player understands what any of it means. Dovahkiin itself, the word that marks the player as something unusual in this world, translates roughly to Dragonborn. And it isn't accidental that the same tongue spoken by Alduin and Paarthurnax is the tongue used to name the one mortal capable of standing against them both. Every word of power carved into the walls scattered across Skyrim is written in this same language. Every shout the player learns throughout their journey, borrowed directly from a vocabulary the Dov themselves built to describe their own dominion. To learn the voice, in other words, is to learn fragments of the dragon's own language, repurposed by mortal mouths for entirely different ends than the ones it was first spoken for. And first among them, greatest of them, was Alduin, the World Eater. The name alone, when you encounter it, scrawled across burial urns and whispered in terrified dialogue throughout Skyrim, carries a weight that nothing else in the game quite matches. He is the beginning and the end stitched into a single creature. The dragon prophesied to consume the world when all its ages have run their course, only to perhaps birth a new one from the wreckage. That's the myth. That's the apocalypse waiting at the edge of every Nordic legend. But before any of that, before he became the thing players spend 40 hours of their lives preparing to fight, Alduin was simply the ruler of dragons during an age now called, plainly and without embellishment in the in-game lore, the Dragon War. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how strange it is that the game asks you to care about events this distant, this mythic, and somehow succeeds. Most stories about ancient gods and world-ending prophecies keep that distance intact, treating the deep past as scenery rather than substance, something referenced in hushed tones but never actually felt. Skyrim takes a different approach with Paarthurnax specifically, because everything about his story refuses to remain comfortably distant. The mountain where it happened is the same mountain you climb. The word walls scattered across the realm are physical, tangible remnants of that era, not metaphors. And the dragon who lived through all of it is not a statue or a painting or a half-remembered name in a dusty tome. He is alive, present, available to speak with directly, carrying that entire mythic weight in a voice you can actually hear. And beside him, not beneath him in stature, Not a mere foot soldier, but beside him, as something closer to kin, stood Paarthurnax. This detail matters more than it might seem to on first hearing it, so let's sit with it a moment. Paarthurnax, the dragon you eventually find perched in serene, windswept solitude, at the very top of the world, the one who teaches you words of power and speaks to you with what almost sounds like grandfatherly patience, was once Alduin's second, his lieutenant. According to the UESP's compiled lore, drawn from the dragon's own confessions and the scattered histories the Greybeards have preserved, Paarthurnax himself describes Alduin not as a master. He merely obeyed, but as something closer to a brother. Two dragons, bound by blood and by the strange fraternity of rule, standing atop a world that had not yet learned to resist them. It's tempting, hearing the calm, almost philosophical voice he uses centuries later, to imagine he was always like that, reflective, gentle even, in the way old men in stories are gentle once their teeth have gone. But that is not who he was during the Dragon War, and the game never lets you forget it. Not really. Not if you listen instead of skipping past his words to get to the next quest marker. Paarthurnax was a dragon among dragons, and dragons in that age did not rule kindly. One reading consistent with what the lore offers is that the dove saw mortals, the men and Nords scraping out their lives on the rock below, the way a man might see ants beneath a boot, useful only insofar as they could be made to serve, and disposable the moment they couldn't. Picture it, if you can, the way you'd picture a story told slow and low by a fire, no rush to it. The dragons did not live among men. They lived above them, literally, wheeling through a sky that belonged entirely to them, landing only to enforce a dominion that did not require justification because nothing existed strong enough to question it. Alduin sat above all of them, and Paarthurnax sat just beneath him, and together, this is the detail that should sit uncomfortably in your chest, together they ruled over the first scattered tribes of men with a cruelty that the dragon himself, centuries later, standing in the wind atop his mountain, will not pretend away. He will not perform innocence for you. When you finally speak to him face to face, there is no moment where he claims he was merely following orders, no moment where he excuses what he did as Alduin's doing alone. He carries it. That's part of what makes him, eventually, such a strange and heavy character to sit with. Not a redeemed villain in the cheap sense, not a creature who simply switched sides and got to keep his hands clean, but something more complicated. A being who did terrible things, who knows he did them, and who has spent longer than any mortal kingdom has existed trying to answer for it. It's worth pausing on what terrible things likely meant in practice, even though the game is careful, almost deliberately so, not to give you a tidy ledger of atrocities. This could imply something more unsettling than a simple list of burned villages, precisely because it isn't itemized. The absence of specifics is its own kind of weight. We are told, through the broader lore the player accumulates from books, dialogue, and the testimony of the Blades, that the era was one of subjugation. Dragons as tyrants, demanding worship, demanding obedience, and meting out fire and ruin against anyone foolish enough to resist. Paarthurnax was not a passive bystander to that order. He enforced it. He was, by his own quiet admission later in life, complicit in maintaining a reign that crushed the will of an entire species beneath the shadow of dragon wings. And yet, and here's where the story actually begins to turn, where the first crack appears in the foundation of that ancient order. Something in Paarthurnax did not sit easily with what he was doing. The lore doesn't dress this up as a sudden conversion, a thunderclap of conscience. Based on what we know from the in-game histories the player can recover, his shift away from Alduin's side seems to have built slowly, the way ice builds on a window, imperceptible until the whole pane is white with it. He watched men resist anyway, even knowing resistance meant death. He watched something in mortal defiance that perhaps the other dragons did not bother to watch at all, dismissing it as noise, as the futile twitching of insects beneath a boot. Paarthurnax watched, and watching, something in him began to wonder if dominion without end was actually what he wanted to spend eternity enforcing. This is the dragon you will eventually meet at the summit of the throat of the world. Not yet though, not for a long while yet, in the story and in this telling both. First, we have to understand exactly what kind of world he turned his back on, exactly what kind of war he ultimately fought against the brother who had ruled beside him, because the price of that betrayal, and it was a true betrayal, the dragons would call it nothing less, cannot be understood without first understanding the scale of what was being betrayed. An empire of fire and absolute will, stretching across the whole of Skyrim's ancient sky, with Alduin at its head and Paarthurnax, for a long, long time, willingly standing just beneath him. The dragon war and the cruelty of dominion. If you want to find the physical scars the dragon war left on Skyrim, you don't need to dig through dialogue trees or dusty tomes alone, though those help. You can walk to them. Word walls scattered across burial mounds and forgotten ruins throughout the province are themselves artifacts of that war, carved by dragon priests in service of Dov Dominion, monuments to an age when the dragons were not legend but lore. Every time you crouch before one of those walls and feel the strange pull of a word entering your mind, you are touching something that predates the Nordic kingdoms by millennia, something built during the precise span of history we're talking about right now. The Dragon War, as Skyrim's lore frames it, was not a single battle or a brief uprising quickly crushed. It was an age, decades, possibly longer, depending on which fragmented account you trust, during which dragons ruled over the scattered tribes of men with what the in-game sources describe as near absolute tyranny. The Dov demanded worship. Entire cults rose around dragon priests, men who chose collaboration over annihilation, who took up masks, some of which the player can still find and don in dungeons today, and administered the will of dragons to other men, because dragons, vast and immortal as they were, still found it efficient to have intermediaries who could walk among mortals and speak their language. It stands to reason that no empire, however overwhelming its raw power, escapes the need for some kind of bureaucracy. And the dragon cult was that bureaucracy, fire-given an administrative structure. Paarthurnax was part of the command of that structure. Not a distant emperor untouched by its daily violence, but, again, Alduin's lieutenant. A position that, in any war you can imagine, mortal or otherwise, means being present where the worst of it happens. The game is restrained about specifics, careful not to hand you a neat catalogue of dragon war crimes. But it doesn't have to be specific for the implication to land with real weight. A creature who held that rank in that war watched villages burn, possibly ordered it. The evidence points toward Paarthurnax having genuine blood on his claws from this era. Not metaphorical blood, not blood washed away by centuries of penance, but the literal kind, spilled when men dared to push back against an order that considered their resistance an offense against natural law. You can hold pieces of that administrative cruelty in your own hands, even now, thousands of years later, if you know where to look. Scattered through Skyrim's burial mounds and forgotten ruins are dragon priest masks, ornate and unsettling, each one belonging to a specific named priest who once served the cult during this exact era. Men who chose collaboration over annihilation and were rewarded for it with power over their fellow mortals. These weren't simple figureheads. The masks themselves carry enchantments, real magical weight, suggesting the dragons invested genuine resources in cultivating this human bureaucracy of obedience, training, and empowering specific individuals to enforce dragon will in places dragons themselves found it inconvenient to personally patrol. When you find one of these masks in a dungeon today, prying it off the corpse of something that has lain undisturbed for millennia, you are holding a small fragment of the exact machinery Paarthurnax once helped operate from above. Not the fire and claws directly, perhaps, but the structure that made fire and claws unnecessary for day-to-day control, the quieter, more permanent violence of a system built to outlast any single act of destruction. And resist they did. This is the part of the story that the Nords themselves remember with pride. The part etched into their cultural memory so deeply that even thousands of years later, the player encounters bards in taverns singing about the era, about heroes who rose against impossible odds. Mortal men and women, lacking wings, lacking flame, lacking anything resembling the raw, destructive power of a dragon, nonetheless refused to simply lie down. They could not match dragons in claws or fire. What they found instead, eventually, was the voice, the Thuum, the same power the player spends the entirety of Skyrim's main quest learning to wield. The same power that lets you shout enemies off cliffs and cool down storms. In the deepest part of the lore, the voice did not originate with men. According to some accounts woven through the game's books and dialogue, mortals first learned it by watching dragons use it, by some accounts taught directly by Paarthurnax himself, in what may be the earliest hint of his eventual betrayal, even before he consciously understood himself as a traitor. It helps, in trying to picture this, to imagine the asymmetry of that early resistance honestly, rather than romantically. A dragon could level a fortified position in moments, could reduce stone walls to rubble and burn entire fields in a single pass, and had been doing exactly that by every implication of the lore, for as long as anyone could remember. Mortal weapons, iron, steel, whatever crude metallurgy the early tribes of men possessed, accomplished essentially nothing against scales that had weathered by the time of the Dragon War, ages beyond ages already. There was no battlefield equation in which men simply outfought dragons through courage and numbers alone. The entire premise of mortal resistance during this era was, by any rational measure available to the people living through it, hopeless. And it was into that specific hopelessness that the voice arrived, not as a convenient plot device, but as the only conceivable answer to an otherwise unanswerable problem. A gift, whether divine or simply rebellious in origin, that changed the actual physics of what resistance could mean. This detail is worth dwelling on, because the game itself treats it as ambiguous, refusing to hand you a clean answer, and a good storyteller should resist the urge to manufacture certainty where the source material offers none. There are two competing versions of how mankind first learned the Thuum, both surface through what Paarthurnax tells you and what Nordic legend separately claims. Paarthurnax himself, when you finally press him on it atop his mountain, will tell you that he taught the first tongues, 3 specific individuals whose names the game preserves with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. After Alduin made what Paarthurnax describes as a false proclamation of godhood. In his telling, his decision to teach men was a direct response to watching Alduin overreach, watching his brother claim a divinity that even by dragon standards struck Paarthurnax as a step too far, a hubris that demanded answering. But Nordic legend, separate from Paarthurnax's own account, claims something different and frankly more mystical. That Paarthurnax was sent by Kine, one of the old Nordic divines, goddess of storms and war, specifically to teach mankind the Thu'um, as a divine intervention rather than a personal act of conscience. One interpretation suggests these two versions aren't necessarily contradictory, so much as they're the same event seen from two different vantage points. The dragon's private memory of his own motivations layered beneath a mortal mythology that needed a god's hand in the story because gods make for better legends than disillusioned dragons do. Either way, what's certain, what the game lets you confirm through both the dragon's own mouth and the structure of the main quest itself, is this. Paarthurnax taught the voice to mortals. He gave the oppressed the exact weapon that would eventually be turned against his own kind, against the empire he had helped build and enforce. Imagine being the dragon who did that. Imagine standing in the sky beside your brother, ruling an entire species through fire and fear, and deciding, for reasons that even centuries later, you struggle to fully articulate to a stranger who's climbed your mountain to ask, that the thing you have built deserves to fall, not because you've been defeated, not because some force has overpowered you and stripped away your choice, but because some understanding crept into you, slow as frost, that what you were participating in was wrong, and that the only way to answer for it was to teach your supposed lessers the means of their own liberation. This is not a small thing. This is not a minor character flaw or a footnote in dragon history. This is, by any measure the game gives us, one of the most consequential acts of betrayal in the entire mythology of Tamriel. Because it didn't simply turn one dragon against the dragons, it armed an entire species against an order that had, until that moment, seemed as permanent and unshakable as the mountains themselves. The first tongues and the voice of betrayal. Three names matter here, and if you've played enough of Skyrim's main quest, you've already encountered traces of them without perhaps realizing how central they are to Paarthurnax's whole story. Gormley, Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, Feldir the Old. These are the first tongues, the original mortal masters of the Thu'um, the ones who took whatever Paarthurnax gave them, whether through his own quiet rebellion or through Kine's divine mandate, or some blend the law never fully resolves, and turned it into something the dragons had never before had to face, mortal voices capable of shouting back. You meet echoes of these three later in the game, in a sequence that, frankly, is one of the more striking moments in Skyrim's main quest, though it's easy to rush through if you're focused only on combat. Within the time wound atop the throat of the world, the Tidaran, the player is able to witness, not merely read about, but actually witness, walking among spectral echoes of the past, the original battle in which these three tongues fought Alduin himself. It's a strange, almost dreamlike sequence, ghostly figures replaying a battle thousands of years gone, and it exists specifically because Paarthurnax tells the player it's the only way to learn the Dragon Wren shout, the legendary weapon used to bring the World Eater down the first time. The fact that this scene is physically present in the game, not merely described in a book you can skim past, anchors everything we're discussing in something the player can stand inside and watch unfold with their own eyes. What you witness there when you finally make the climb and unlock that vision with an Elder Scroll in hand is mortals doing something no dragon believed mortals were capable of, shouting Dragonrend, a word of power so saturated with hatred and so rooted in the specifically mortal experience of suffering under dragon rule that, according to what Arngir and Paarthurnax both explain, no dragon could ever learn it themselves. It stands to reason why. Dragonrend forces the concept of mortality itself onto its target, makes an immortal creature feel, for a few agonizing moments, what it is to be breakable, to be temporary, to be capable of dying. And a dragon cannot conceive of that concept well enough to wield it as a weapon, because dragons do not fundamentally believe in their own deaths. Only those who had truly suffered under that immortal weight, who understood mortality not as an abstract concept, but as the entire shape of their daily existence, could forge a shout-out of that suffering and turn it back against the thing that caused it. This is the weapon the First Tongues used against Alduin here, on this exact mountain, in the exact spot the player eventually climbs to meet Paarthurnax centuries later. And it worked, in the sense that it grounded him, stripped him of the unshakable confidence of an immortal creature who had never needed to fear anything mortal hands could do. But Dragonrend alone wasn't enough to finish what the tongue started. It bought them an opening, nothing more, a crack of vulnerability in something that had never before shown any vulnerability at all. To actually end the threat, even temporarily, they needed something beyond mortal invention. They needed an Elder Scroll, the Kell, as the dragon language calls it, an artifact from outside the normal flow of time, and with it, they didn't kill Alduin so much as they cast him forward through the centuries, flinging him into a future he wasn't meant to occupy yet, buying the world thousands of years it otherwise would never have had. Paarthurnax explains all of this to the player eventually, atop his mountain, with a kind of weary precision that suggests he has turned the memory over in his mind more times than anyone should have to. Varugt Unslad, he calls it. Perhaps none but he now remembers exactly how Alduin was defeated, because perhaps none but he was standing close enough to that ancient battle, on the wrong side of it, to carry the memory forward with this much clarity. He says this almost wistfully, the way someone might speak of an old wound that has healed crooked, but never fully closed. But here's the thing worth sitting with before we move forward in this story. While the tongues were fighting his brother on this mountain, where was Paarthurnax? He had already, by this point, made his choice. He had already taught them, already turned his back on Alduin's order, already accepted that the empire he'd helped build and enforce needed to fall. And yet, the cost of that choice was not something he could simply walk away from once the decision was made. Betraying Alduin didn't just mean opposing one dragon in one battle. It meant standing against every other dragon who remained loyal to the old order, against an entire species that, by every account the game offers, did not take kindly to being taught how to die by one of their own. Paarthurnax did not merely flip an allegiance, he made himself an enemy to nearly everything he had once belonged to, and he did it knowing. Because how could he not know, having ruled with them for so long, exactly what the cost of that defiance would eventually be? This is the moment the story asks you to really feel, more than understand intellectually, not the broad strokes of dragon politics, but the specific, lonely weight of a creature choosing to dismantle the only world he had ever known, siding with beings he had once ruled over and, by his own admission, once harmed, knowing that his own kind would never forgive him for it. He wasn't doing this for personal gain. There was no throne waiting for him among men, no comfortable retirement promised by the tongues in exchange for his help. He simply decided, at some point during that long, slow accumulation of conscience, that what was happening was wrong, and that knowledge demanded action, even though the action would cost him everything he had been. Consider for a moment what he actually gave up in making that decision. Beyond the obvious matter of standing in the dragon's way, he gave up the certainty of belonging to the side that was winning. Whatever else might be said about the morality of the old dragon order, it was, in the most basic structural sense, the dominant power in the world at that time, unchallenged, secure, permanent in every way, a young species like mankind could not hope to match. To turn against that order wasn't simply a moral stance, it was a wager against the apparent direction of history itself, made by a creature who had every reason to believe, based on everything he had witnessed up to that point, that the wager would almost certainly fail. He taught the tongues anyway. He gave away the one advantage his own kind held over every other species in the world, knowing that doing so might not be enough, might simply result in his own destruction alongside theirs, without ever actually accomplishing the change he hoped for. That he turned out to be right, that the gamble eventually paid off, that the tongues did manage, against every reasonable expectation, to bring down the world eater himself on this very mountain, doesn't erase the magnitude of the risk he took in making that choice before knowing how it would end. He couldn't have known. No one climbing the throat of the world today, walking in the footsteps of that ancient decision, should mistake the eventual victory for an inevitability that Paarthurnax could have foreseen with any confidence. He acted on conviction alone, against odds that any rational creature would have called impossible. And he did it knowing that even success would cost him his place among his own kind forever. It's also worth remembering that the names of the first tongues survive specifically because of what they accomplished here, while countless other Nords who resisted dragon rule during this same era left no name behind at all, their resistance and their deaths swallowed by a history that simply didn't have room to remember everyone who fought and lost. Gormley, Hakon, and Feldir are the exceptions, not the rule. 3 names plucked out of an otherwise nameless struggle because they happened to be standing at the exact moment and place where the struggle finally turned. There's something worth sitting with in that disproportion. The way history compresses an entire age of suffering and resistance down into a handful of remembered names, while the bulk of what people actually endured during the Dragon War simply vanishes, unrecorded, into the same silence Paarthurnax has spent the centuries since trying, in his own way, to answer for. The battle atop the sacred mountain. Here is where the story's geography becomes its emotional center, because everything that follows, every century of Paarthurnax's exile, every word he speaks to the player when they finally meet him, happens because of what occurred on one specific patch of stone at the absolute top of Tamriel. The throat of the world isn't simply Skyrim's tallest mountain, because the game's designers wanted an impressive vista. It is the most sacred mountain in Skyrim specifically, because this is the spot, the very spot, where Alduin was first brought down. Paarthurnax tells the player this directly, calling it Zok Revak Strunma, the great mountain of the world, and the reverence in how he says it, even in text, even read silently rather than heard, carries the unmistakable sense of a creature speaking about hallowed ground he has never been able to leave. Picture it as it must have looked, if you can, somewhere in that haze of deep antiquity the game lets you glimpse only through the time wound. 3 mortals, the first tongues, standing exposed on a summit higher than any other point in the known world, facing down the literal world eater, a creature whose name alone had, until that day, been enough to make entire tribes prostrate themselves. No army at their backs, No fortress walls to retreat behind. Just the wind, the cold, the thin air that makes every breath a labor even now in the present day, when the player finally makes that same climb, wearing modern armor and carrying modern weapons. And against that wind and that thin air and that overwhelming sense of exposure, 3 mortal voices, recently gifted with a power their ancestors never had, opened their mouths and shouted at a god. There is something worth noticing about the precise nature of the time wound itself, the strange scar in reality that allows the player much later to actually step inside this ancient memory, rather than simply hear it described secondhand. Tid Aran, Paarthurnax, calls it the time wound, a phrase that suggests something closer to an injury inflicted on time itself than a mere historical record. This isn't a memory preserved the way a book preserves a memory, through ink and paper and the fallible recollection of whoever wrote it down. It's a tear, an actual rupture in the ordinary passage of moments, left behind by the Elder Scrolls' use on this exact spot, persisting at the summit for thousands of years afterward, like a wound that never fully closed over. The player doesn't read about the battle between the First Tongues and Alduin. They walk into it, watching the ghostly past replay itself in real time, an experience the game offers nowhere else with quite this same intimacy, because nowhere else did a scroll tear so violently at the fabric of a single place and a single moment. Dragonren struck first, the lore tells us, and for the first time in the memory of any living dragon. Alduin felt something close to the terror he had spent his entire existence inflicting on others. The shout forced mortality onto him, however briefly, made the World Eater taste, just for a moment, the specific vulnerability of being a thing that can die, a sensation as foreign and unbearable to him as breathing underwater would be to you or me. It's worth remembering that no dragon, not even Paarthurnax, with all his wisdom and all his eventual remorse, could ever learn this particular shout, precisely because no dragon could authentically conceive of his own ending. Only the tongues, who had spent their whole lives under the literal shadow of that ending, possessed the specific, hard-won understanding necessary to forge a weapon out of it. And once Alduin staggered under that weight, the tongues moved to finish what the shout had only begun. The Elder Scroll came out, held, the lore suggests, by whichever of the 3 tongues had been entrusted with its keeping, though the game leaves the precise mechanics of its use appropriately mysterious, the way an artifact from outside time probably should remain mysterious even to those who wielded it. They didn't kill him. This needs to be said plainly because it's a detail the player only fully appreciates once they've finished the entire main quest and understood the scope of what they were actually doing throughout their own journey. The First Tongues did not slay Alduin on this mountain. They couldn't. What they did instead, using the scroll's strange power over the currents of time, was cast him forward, flinging the World Eater out of his own era entirely and into a distant future neither he nor they could fully comprehend. They bought the world an age of peace by exiling their enemy into tomorrow, rather than ending him today. It's a strange kind of victory when you sit with it, not a triumph in the way songs later told it. And the game is careful to undercut the heroic mythology, even as it lets you witness the genuine courage of what happened. Paarthurnax himself, with characteristic precision, corrects the player's assumption that Alduin was simply defeated. Vik nus nikron, he says. Yes and no. Alduin was not truly defeated either, he tells you. Because if he had been, you would not be standing here in the present day, centuries later, having to deal with his return. The victory atop the throat of the world was real, But it was a deferral, not an ending. A debt postponed, with interest, to be collected by a future generation who would have no choice but to finish what the first tongue started. And where was Paarthurnax during all of this? This is the part of the story that the game lets you infer more than state outright, and it's worth approaching it honestly rather than inventing certainty the source material doesn't provide. Based on what we know of his position, his teaching of the tongues, and the timing of his eventual self-imposed exile to this exact location, it seems clear that Paarthurnax's break with Alduin and his role in this battle were intimately connected, even if the game never gives us a frame-by-frame account of him standing beside the tongues in physical combat against his own brother. What we know for certain is that after this battle, after Alduin was cast into the folds of time and the immediate threat of his rule was lifted from the world, Paarthurnax did not return to whatever remained of Dragon Society. He did not seek out other surviving Dov and tried to rebuild some semblance of the old order, nor did he flee somewhere distant and hide from the consequences of what he'd done. He stayed right here, on this mountain, at the exact spot where the time wound had torn open, where his brother had been flung out of his proper era, where the entire shape of his existence had been irrevocably altered by a choice he made and could never unmake. Think for a moment about what it would mean to watch that happen, to watch a brother, and the word brother again is Paarthurnax's own, not a loose interpretation imposed on the relationship from outside. Get cast out of his own era by mortals wielding a weapon you yourself had armed them with. There is no clean emotional category for that experience. It isn't quite grief, because Alduin wasn't dead, merely displaced, merely deferred into a future that hadn't happened yet. It isn't quite triumph either, not in any way that could have felt celebratory to a creature who had spent so long ruling beside the dragon now being unmade in front of him. Whatever Paarthurnax felt in that moment, standing on this mountain while the ancient tongues finished what his own teaching had made possible, the game leaves entirely to inference, and perhaps that's appropriate, because some feelings resist being translated even by the dragon language's notoriously expressive vocabulary. Some things simply have to be carried in silence, which is, in the end, exactly what he chose to do with it. For thousands of years afterward, he has not left since, not meaningfully, not in any way that matters to the thousands of years that followed. And to understand why a creature with wings, with the entire sky available to him, would choose instead to remain rooted to one mountaintop for the rest of recorded history, we need to look at exactly what that choice cost him, and exactly what kind of solitude he built for himself in the centuries that followed his betrayal. Centuries of silence, the throne above the clouds. There's a particular kind of cold that settles into a story once you understand its true timescale. And Paarthurnax's exile operates on a timescale that should genuinely unsettle you if you let it. We are not talking about a dragon who sulked on a mountain for a few decades after a hard battle. We are talking about thousands of years. The Dragon War occurred in what the game's chronology places deep in Skyrim's mythic past, predating even the earliest recorded eras of Nordic civilization. And Paarthurnax has remained, by his own account, and by the structure of the game's lore, at the peak of the throat of the world essentially without interruption since that battle concluded. Empires have risen and crumbled to dust in less time than this dragon has spent sitting in roughly the same patch of wind-scoured stone. Try, for a moment, to actually sit with what that means, rather than simply accepting it as a fact to be filed away. Dragons are immortal, or near enough to it that the distinction barely matters across the span we're discussing. Paarthurnax did not grow old in any meaningful sense during these centuries. He did not slowly decline towards some natural conclusion that would make his solitude feel like the gentle final chapter of a long life. He simply continued, conscious, aware, present for thousands of years, on one mountain, largely alone, carrying the memory of everything he had been and everything he had done with a clarity that time itself never dulled. Mortals forget. It's one of the small mercies of a short life. The sharp edges of old guilt eventually soften, blur, get buried under the accumulation of new days. Paarthurnax never got that mercy. Every atrocity he committed during the Dragon War remained as vivid to him, presumably, on the 1000th anniversary as it had been the day after it happened, because nothing in his nature allowed the wound to scar over the way mortal wounds do. What does a being do with that kind of time, carrying that kind of memory? The game's answer, embedded in everything Paarthurnax says, and everything the world tells you about him before you ever meet him face to face, is meditation. Not meditation in the loose, casual sense the word sometimes gets used. Paarthurnax's stillness atop the mountain is not a hobby or a pleasant pastime. It is, by every indication the law provides, the central organizing discipline of his entire existence, a centuries-long act of penance disguised as contemplation, or perhaps contemplation disguised as penance. The line between the two blurs the longer you sit with his story. He withdrew from the world almost entirely. He did not seek out mortal kingdoms to rule, did not attempt to position himself as a benevolent replacement for the tyranny he'd helped dismantle. He simply stayed, mostly silent, mostly still, watching the centuries pass beneath him from a vantage point higher than anything else in the land. This is worth contrasting directly with what we know of Alduin's other former servants. The dragons who remained loyal to the old order, scattered and weakened after their leader's defeat, but not gone, not eliminated. Throughout Skyrim, the player encounters their burial mounds, their word walls, the remnants of a cult that, even diminished, never fully vanished from the land. Some of these dragons, the game makes clear, eventually entered a kind of dormancy themselves, sealed away in burial sites scattered across the province, waiting. Though waiting for what? Most of them probably couldn't have articulated, since the specific mechanism of Alduin's eventual return was something only the World Eater himself, and perhaps Paarthurnax, fully understood. But Paarthurnax's stillness was different in kind from theirs, even if it superficially resembled it. He wasn't dormant. He wasn't sealed in a tomb waiting passively for resurrection. He was awake the entire time, aware, choosing solitude rather than having it imposed on him by burial rites or magical sleep. And the isolation wasn't merely physical, though the physical isolation alone would have been staggering enough. A creature perched above the cloud line, above the weather that batters everyone else in Skyrim, in air so thin and cold that even the hardiest Nords need magical assistance to survive an extended stay there. It was also, by every implication the dialogue gives us, an isolation of kinship. Paarthurnax had no brother anymore, not in any way that mattered. Alduin had been cast into the future, an enemy now, rather than kin. Someone Paarthurnax would eventually have to help defeat all over again, rather than someone he could return to. The other surviving dragons, the ones who remained loyal to the old order even in its diminished state, regarded him, when they regarded him at all, as a traitor, a defector, the dragon who had armed mankind against his own kind. There was no faction left for Paarthurnax to belong to. He had given up his place among the Dov the moment he taught the tongues the voice. and he had never sought, nor by all appearances ever wanted, to build a new place for himself among the mortals he'd helped liberate. This is one interpretation worth lingering on, that Paarthurnax's centuries of meditation atop the throat of the world function less like a retirement and more like a self-imposed sentence, one he never appealed and never tried to shorten. He had the power, certainly, to leave. Nothing physically bound him to that mountain, the way a prisoner is bound by chains or walls. He stayed because some part of him, call it conscience, call it grief, call it an attempt at penance that he understood could never actually be completed, required him to remain exactly where the consequences of his choice had first fully manifested, watching the world he had helped reshape continue on without him, century after century, while he sat with everything he had done and everything that doing it had cost. There's another dimension to this solitude worth considering, one the game doesn't state outright, but that emerges naturally if you think through the practical reality of what Paarthurnax's continued existence actually meant for the dragons who remained. A defector of his stature couldn't simply be ignored by the Dove, who survived the war's aftermath. He had, after all, given mankind the exact tool that ended their dominion. And dragons, even scattered and weakened, do not forget a betrayal of that magnitude easily. It stands to reason that the mountain itself, isolated as it was, also functioned as a kind of fortress by virtue of its inaccessibility. Not a fortress with walls, but one built from elevation and storm and distance. A place few dragons would have reason to seek him out, and even fewer mortals could physically reach. His solitude may have begun as penance, but across the centuries it likely also became, by simple necessity, a form of protection, the safest place in all of Tamriel, for a creature who belonged fully to neither side of the war he'd helped end. And there is the matter of what he actually did, hour after hour, year after year, century after century, in that solitude. Because meditation, however central it was to his existence, could not have been the entirety of it. The game gestures toward this through the sheer accumulated mastery he displays when the player finally meets him, a fluency with the voice that surpasses every other living practitioner, by a margin the Greybeards themselves acknowledge without reservation. Centuries of uninterrupted practice, of turning the same words of power over and over in a mind that never tired and never needed rest the way mortal minds do, produce something that no amount of mortal study, however devoted, could ever fully replicate. There's a particular kind of melancholy in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it. The very thing that made him most capable of helping the world when the world finally needed him again was also the thing his isolation had been quietly perfecting all along, as if some part of him understood, long before any prophecy confirmed it, that his solitude was not truly an ending, but a long, patient preparation for a moment still centuries away. There is one detail worth setting aside here, small but striking, that complicates the idea that his exile was total and unbroken across all those centuries. By his own recollection, shared only in passing, Paarthurnax once visited a captured dragon named Numinex, held prisoner far below in Dragon's Reach, sometime around the first era of recorded history. It's a brief, almost throwaway mention, easy to miss if you're not listening closely, but it reframes the picture slightly. His solitude was not, apparently, an absolute and unbroken stillness from the moment of Alduin's first defeat onward. At least once, across the vast stretch of his exile, he descended from the mountain, or extended his awareness far enough to encounter another of his own kind, this one bound and held by mortals, rather than roaming free as the Dove once had. What passed between them in that meeting The game never says, but imagine it anyway, the way you might imagine any quiet, unrecorded moment between two old survivors of a world neither of them belongs to any longer. The dragon who had taught mankind to defeat dragons, standing near the cage of another dove, one of the few living reminders left of the world he had once ruled and then helped dismantle. Whether that encounter brought him any comfort, or only deepened the isolation he already carried, is left entirely to the listener's own imagining, the way the best of these old stories often are. The Greybeards and the weight of a name. Eventually, of course, men did come to the mountain, not immediately, not for a very long time after the Dragon War's end, but eventually, as men inevitably do, drawn by stories of a sacred peak, by the strange residual power that seemed to cling to the place where Alduin had once been defeated. What grew up around the base of the throat of the world in the fullness of time was High Hrothgar, the ancient monastery the player visits early in Skyrim's main quest, home to an order of monks called the Greybeards, who have devoted their entire existence to the study and discipline of the voice. The order traces its founding to a figure named Jurgen Windcaller, whose horn the player retrieves early in the main quest, well before any mention of Paarthurnax enters the story at all. Windcaller's own history matters here, because it establishes the exact philosophical tension the Greybeards still carry centuries later. By the legends preserved at High Hrothgar, Windcaller was once a war leader, a tongue who used his voice as a weapon the way most ambitious Nords of his era did, until his army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Red Mountain. Based on what we know from the lore the player can read on those same etched steps, he spent the following 7 years in solitary contemplation, trying to understand how a voice as strong as his could have failed him so completely, and eventually concluded that the Nords had grown arrogant in turning the voice toward conquest rather than toward the worship and glory of the gods. That conclusion became the seed of the way of the voice, and the 7 years of meditation that produced it became the model for everything the Greybeards still practice today. It's worth noticing how closely this mirrors Paarthurnax's own withdrawal to the same mountain centuries earlier, even though the two events are separated by an entire age of history and arise from very different catastrophes. A mortal warrior humbled by a single lost battle, and an ancient dragon haunted by an entire lost war, both arrived independently at the same conclusion, that the only honest response to power used wrongly was retreat, stillness, and a long, patient reconsideration of what that power was actually meant for. The connection between the Greybeards and Paarthurnax is not incidental. It is, in fact, the entire reason the Order exists in its current form. According to the lore, the player can piece together, through conversations with Anger and the other Greybeards, after High Hrothgar's construction, Paarthurnax became the Grandmaster of this order. Its acknowledged leader, the figure whose mastery of the way of the voice surpasses every living practitioner by a margin so wide it isn't really a competition at all. And yet, crucially, he did not descend from his solitude to actually lead them in any conventional sense. He remained in seclusion at the peak, exactly where he had been for centuries already, and the Greybeards built their entire monastic philosophy. A philosophy centered on restraint, on using the voice sparingly and for peace rather than violence, partly in deference to a master they could climb toward but rarely actually reach. This detail deserves more attention than a casual playthrough usually gives it. The Greybeards speak of Paarthurnax with something close to religious awe well before the player ever meets him. He lives in seclusion, Anger tells you, on the very peak of the mountain, and he speaks to them only rarely, and never to outsiders. Being permitted to see him at all is described as a great privilege, something earned rather than granted casually. For an entire monastic order, humans who have devoted their whole lives to spiritual discipline, to treat audience with this creature as a rare and precious thing tells you everything about the scale of what Paarthurnax represents within Skyrim's spiritual landscape. He is not merely an old dragon who happens to know some impressive shouts. He is functionally the founder and unspoken deity of an entire religious tradition, even though, as far as the game shows us, he never asked to be treated that way and seems almost uncomfortable in his own dialogue with the reverence the Greybeards extend to him. But here is where the story's central tension begins to sharpen into something the player can no longer avoid once they actually start engaging with the main quest seriously. Not everyone trusts Paarthurnax. Not everyone is willing to extend him the reverence the Greybeards do. The game tells us plainly, through multiple sources, that even long after the Dragon War's conclusion, few but the Greybeards genuinely trust this dragon, and the distrust comes from two distinct directions that compound rather than cancel each other out. Partly, it's simply his race. He is a dragon, after all, in a world where dragons spent millennia as the literal embodiment of mortal subjugation. And old fears don't evaporate just because one individual member of a feared species claims to have changed his ways. But mostly, and more pointedly, the distrust comes specifically from his past, from the documented, undeniable fact that he was Alduin's lieutenant, that he participated in atrocities against mankind before his change of heart, regardless of how genuinely that change of heart eventually proved itself through his teaching of the first tongues. And nowhere does this distrust burn hotter or more personally than among the Blades, the ancient order of dragon hunters the player eventually allies with through Delphine and Esbern. The game is explicit about this. The Blades are especially distrustful of Paarthurnax, and they wish him dead. Not merely suspicious of him, not merely cautious in his presence. They actively want him killed, and as the main quest unfolds, this isn't simply background color. It becomes an active demand they will eventually place directly on the player. A demand that forces a genuinely difficult choice we'll sit with properly later in this story. It's worth understanding how the player even arrives at Paarthurnax's door in the first place, because the path runs directly through the Blade's own buried history. Long before any conversation atop the mountain takes place, the trail leads to Skyhaven Temple, an ancient stronghold hidden away and largely forgotten, where Esbern, the last Blade still clinging to a fragile paranoid existence after the Order's near-total destruction generations earlier, has spent years in hiding, surrounded by the Order's oldest secrets. Carved into the temple's stone is Alduin's Wall, a massive mural depicting the entire Dragon War in relief. The first tongues, the World Eater, the ancient prophecy of his return. All of it preserved in stone by hands that understood, even thousands of years ago, that someone in the future would eventually need this record. It is only by deciphering that wall, piecing together fragments of a war that predates every kingdom the player has ever set foot in, that Delphine and Esbern arrive at the conclusion that a shout, not a sword, ended Alduin the first time, and that the only living creature who might know how to learn it again has always sat at the summit of the throat of the world. What's remarkable, given the depth of that hostility directed at him from one of Tamriel's most storied institutions, is how Paarthurnax himself responds to it, at least according to everything the game shows us about his character once you finally meet him. He does not rage against the unfairness of being judged for a past he cannot undo. He does not deflect responsibility onto Alduin, claiming he was merely following orders from a dragon more powerful than himself. The lore notes something striking about his self-understanding. He considers himself to be only what his father Akatosh made him to be, a phrase that carries real philosophical weight if you let it sit, suggesting a creature who has spent centuries wrestling not just with guilt over specific actions, but with the deeper, harder question of whether a being can truly be held responsible for a nature it did not choose for itself, while simultaneously, through his actions, demonstrating that he believes the answer is yes. Responsibility remains, nature notwithstanding. And despite all of this, despite the distrust, despite the Blade's open desire to see him dead, despite centuries of isolation that would have given any reasonable creature ample justification for bitterness, Paarthurnax remains, by every account the game gives us, willing to share his knowledge freely with anyone who genuinely seeks it, and remains hospitable even in the face of death itself. This isn't speculation dressed up as fact. It's borne out directly in how he behaves when the player finally reaches him, and later, in the quiet, almost serene way he responds, when the question of his own ending is eventually placed in front of him. Whatever else can be said about this dragon, whatever weight of history he carries, he does not meet the world's suspicion with cruelty in return. He meets it, somehow, with patience. This is the figure the player is finally about to climb a mountain to meet. Not yet fully understood, not yet fully trusted, but established by this point in the story as something far stranger and far more morally complicated than a simple wise old mentor waiting at the top of a quest marker. It's worth pausing too on what the Greybeards' own philosophy reveals about the shadow Paarthurnax casts over their entire way of life. Even from a distance, even in near total silence, the Order's central discipline is restraint, using the voice as sparingly as possible, training for years simply to whisper words of power, rather than shout them, treating the full, unleashed Thu'um as something almost too dangerous to wield carelessly. This philosophy did not emerge from nowhere. It exists, the game suggests, at least in part because the Greybeards understand, better than almost anyone else in Skyrim, exactly what the voice is capable of when wielded without restraint, because the entire Dragon War was, in some sense, a demonstration of unrestrained power, answered by more unrestrained power. Paarthurnax taught mortals the voice so they could end a tyranny, but the Greybeards who inherited that legacy seem to have drawn from it a different lesson entirely, that power used carelessly, even in service of a just cause, leaves its own scars, and that the safest way to honor what the voice cost to win is to use it as little as possible, however strong you eventually become. There's an irony worth noticing in this, one the game never spells out directly, but that becomes obvious if you sit with it. The Order, founded in deference to a dragon who once enforced absolute careless dominion through force, has built its entire subsequent philosophy on the opposite principle: humility, restraint, the deliberate withholding of power, even when it's available. Paarthurnax, in other words, did not simply teach mortals to fight. He inadvertently taught an entire tradition to distrust unrestrained strength, including, implicitly, his own former nature, the very thing he had been before his betrayal of Alduin. Whether that was his intention or simply an accident of how mortals chose to interpret the gift he'd given them, it's difficult not to read it as another quiet form of penance, one that outlived him in the institution he never fully joined, but nonetheless shaped from a distance, century after century, without ever descending from his mountain to claim credit for it. It's worth adding finally that the Greybeards' reluctance to use the voice loudly, the careful whispering most of them practice instead of shouting, gives the player's own first lessons at High Hrothgar. A strange double meaning once you understand what's waiting above. You arrive expecting training in raw power and instead receive lessons in restraint. Lessons that only make full sense once you've stood at the summit and heard firsthand the weariness in the voice of the one creature whose mastery of that same power never once protected him from the weight of having used it wrongly long ago, in a war neither of you were alive to witness except him. The 7,000 steps. There is a particular kind of physical storytelling that Skyrim does better than almost any other game from its era, and the climb to High Hrothgar is one of its finest examples, precisely because the game never rushes you through it. The path is called, in the dialogue of the people who live along its base, the 7,000 steps, a name that sounds almost mythic until you actually walk it and realize the number isn't exaggeration for poetic effect. It is, more or less, the literal scale of what stands between the lowland village of Ivarstead and the monastery clinging to the mountainside above the clouds. You begin in comparative warmth. Ivarstead itself sits in a green river valley, modest and unremarkable, the kind of place that exists in countless fantasy worlds without drawing particular attention to itself. But from its edge, the path begins, marked by carved stone steps that climb immediately and without much mercy into terrain that grows steadily more hostile the higher you go. This is deliberately an act of pilgrimage built directly into the game's mechanics. You are not teleported to your destination. You are not given a swift mount that trivializes the distance if you choose to walk it. And many players, especially the first time, do choose to walk it because something about the framing of those steps makes shortcuts feel like a kind of cheating. You feel every stretch of that climb in the slow accumulation of changing scenery around you. Along the way, scattered at intervals up the slope, are small stone shrines and weathered markers left by pilgrims who walked this exact road long before any dragonborn ever needed to. This is, after all, a path that existed for ordinary religious purposes long before the main quest gives it any urgency. Travelers seeking the Greybeards' counsel, the occasional penitent hoping for nothing more than quiet reflection at the top, none of them aware that the dragon waiting far above the monastery they're climbing toward carries the entire weight of the world's oldest war on his shoulders. Walking past those markers, you're reminded that this road has always served two purposes at once, ordinary and extraordinary layered over each other so completely that most of the people who ever climbed it never knew the second purpose existed at all. The trees thin first, then the grass gives way to scattered rock and hardier alpine growth, then to nothing but stone and ice, and the occasional hardy flower clinging stubbornly to a crevice that shouldn't be able to support anything alive. Wind that was a gentle presence in the valley becomes, by the upper reaches of the path, a constant howling force you have to brace against. The kind of sound that gets into your thoughts the way silence sometimes does, filling the space where conversation or distraction would normally sit. Snow that began as a light dusting becomes drifts deep enough to slow your stride. Frost wolves and the occasional troll lurk in the high passes. Dangers that feel less like deliberately placed game encounters and more like the natural hazards a genuine mountain pilgrimage would actually present to anyone foolish or devoted enough to attempt it. And the entire time, looming above everything, growing neither closer nor farther away, with any speed that matches your effort, is the mountain itself, the actual peak, far above even High Hrothgar's already considerable elevation. wreathed in clouds and storm in a way that makes its true summit functionally invisible from the lower path. This matters enormously for the emotional architecture of what's coming. The player, walking this road for the first time, cannot see where Paarthurnax actually waits. They can only see the monastery, itself an imposing structure built directly into the mountainside, its grey stone walls so perfectly matched to the surrounding rock that it sometimes seems less constructed than grown, the way a fortress carved by patient monks across generations might begin to resemble the bones of the mountain that hosts it. Reaching High Hrothgar itself is, for most players, already a significant accomplishment, a destination that feels earned by the climb required to reach it. And this is precisely the point at which the game reveals that High Hrothgar is not, in fact, the end of the journey at all. It is instead only the beginning of the part of the climb that actually matters for Paarthurnax's story. Beyond the monastery's walls, past the Greybeards, who have spent their lives in disciplined silence within these halls, the path continues upward into terrain even more hostile than what came before, terrain that the Greybeards themselves describe as accessible only to those whose voice, meaning their mastery of the Thu'um, has grown strong enough to part the supernatural storms that guard the upper reaches of the mountain from casual intrusion. This is not flavor text. This is mechanically true within the game itself. The path beyond High Hrothgar is genuinely blocked, in the literal sense of gameplay, by perpetual blizzards and freezing winds that the player cannot simply walk through with sufficient stamina or sufficiently warm clothing. The Greybeards teach the player the Clear Skies shout specifically and exclusively to make this final ascent possible. 3 words: Lok, Var, Kor, Sky, Spring, Summer, combined into a single shout capable of momentarily parting the supernatural storms guarding the upper mountain. It's worth sitting with the symbolism the game has built into this requirement, intentional or not. You cannot reach Paarthurnax through force, through stubbornness, through simply being strong enough to push past obstacles the way you might push past a difficult enemy in combat. You can only reach him by demonstrating mastery of the exact same gift he gave to mortals in the first place. The voice itself becomes the key, fittingly, to unlocking an audience with the dragon who, in some very real sense, started the entire tradition of mortals wielding it. So you climb again, beyond the monastery, into air so thin and cold that even the game's interface seems to acknowledge the strain. The howling wind so constant it becomes its own kind of silence, the way certain sounds, sustained long enough without variation, stop registering as noise and start registering as the simple texture of a place. Ice wraiths drift through this upper terrain, ghostly and dangerous, creatures that feel less like conventional monsters and more like extensions of the mountain's own hostility toward intruders. There is no soft transition here, no gentle slope easing you toward your destination. Every step upward is visibly, physically difficult, a climb that the game wants you to feel in something closer to your own body than simply your character's stamina bar. Because what waits at the top of this climb is not meant to feel like an ordinary quest destination. It is meant to feel like an arrival at something genuinely separate from the rest of the world below. A place suspended above the ordinary business of Skyrim's wars and politics and daily survival, untouched by all of it, existing instead in a much older, much stranger silence that has been accumulating, undisturbed, for thousands of years. And then, after all of that, after Ivarstead, after the 7,000 steps, after High Hrothgar and its disciplined silence, after the storms parted by your own borrowed mastery of the voice, you finally crest the last rise, and there is nothing above you anymore. No further peak, no further climb. Just the wind and the cold, and an ancient, ruined word wall standing alone in the open air at the absolute top of the world, waiting, the way it has been waiting for longer than any kingdom below has existed. It's worth pausing here before the meeting itself to notice what the climb has actually done to you as a player. Regardless of how many hours you've already spent in Skyrim's world by the time you attempted. Most of the game's locations announce themselves through markers on a map, distances measured in fast travel convenience rather than felt experience. The throat of the world resists that flattening, at least the first time, in a way few other places in the game manage. Even players who eventually learn the various tricks for bypassing portions of the climb, sliding along the mountainside on horseback, exploiting the terrain to skip ahead of the storms, tend to describe the first honest ascent as something that lingers differently in memory than an ordinary quest. There's a reason for that, and it isn't accidental. The distance between the world below and the dragon waiting above isn't simply geographic. It's the distance between the world Paarthurnax abandoned and the silence he chose instead. And the game asks you to cross that same distance, step by step, before it allows you to understand why he chose it. Consider too what the mountain looks like from below. From any of the dozens of holds and villages scattered across Skyrim's lowlands, visible on a clear day as a pale, jagged silhouette rising above every other peak in the province. For thousands of years, every farmer, every soldier, every child in every settlement beneath that summit has glanced up at some point and seen it there, distant and unreachable, without ever knowing, most of them anyway, that something ancient and aware sat at its peak the entire time, watching the centuries pass the way you might watch clouds drift across a sky you've stopped expecting anything from. There's a particular kind of loneliness embedded in that image, a creature visible to an entire civilization, and yet, for all practical purposes, completely unseen by it, present in plain sight, and yet as remote from mortal awareness as if he existed in another world entirely. Drem Lock. The first meeting. There is a particular stillness to the summit that the game achieves through almost nothing but absence. Absence of trees, absence of structures beyond the lone weathered word wall, absence of any other living thing visible across the vast grey-white expanse of rock and snow stretching in every direction. You stand there, having earned this view through every grueling step that came before it, and for a moment, nothing happens at all. The wind moves. Snow drifts across stone that has felt thousands of years of exactly this same wind, exactly this same drifting snow, with nothing to mark the passage of all that time except the slow, patient erosion of rock that erodes more slowly than almost anything else in the world. And then a roar splits the sky. This is the moment the game has been building toward through every single step of the 7,000 steps, through every storm parted with borrowed words of power, through every piece of lore the player has accumulated about a dragon who taught mortals to defy his own kind and then disappeared into self-imposed exile for longer than recorded history. Paarthurnax descends, wings vast against the sky that, until this moment, had felt entirely empty, and lands on the mountain's peak with a presence that the game's animation handles with surprising restraint. Not the violent, predatory landing of a hostile dragon encountered in the wild, ready to breathe fire and tear into you with claws, but something closer to a deliberate, almost ceremonial settling. A creature lowering himself onto ground he has occupied for longer than the player's entire species has maintained continuous civilization. And then he speaks, and the voice that comes out of him is not what most players expect. Not after everything they've heard about his role in the Dragon War, about the atrocities of his past, about the genuine danger that any dragon, even an apparently reformed one, theoretically represents. Drem your log, he says. Greetings, Wunderneek. I am Paarthurnax. The dragon language phrase breaks down, word by word, into something like peace, fire and sky. And based on what we know from how the language is used elsewhere in the game, this seems to function less as a literal sentence and more as a ceremonial greeting, the dragon equivalent of a respectful hello, rather than a phrase meant to be passed grammatically. It's worth noting that this is, by every indication the game gives, simply how Paarthurnax greets visitors, a habit worn smooth by repetition across centuries, though the player, hearing it for the first time, has no way of knowing that yet. He asks who you are, what brings you to his slumber, catching himself, correcting the dragon word into the more accessible mortal term, my mountain. A small, almost throwaway moment of linguistic courtesy that nonetheless says something about a creature choosing, deliberately, to meet a mortal stranger part way, rather than retreating fully into the alien grandeur of his own tongue. If you respond, he continues, asking why you've come, why you intrude on his meditation, framed not as hostility, but genuine, patient curiosity. The question of a being who has had, by all appearances, very little company across the long centuries of his exile, and who seems, beneath the formality of dragon custom, almost mildly interested in whatever has driven a mortal to climb this far. And then, before any real conversation can proceed, he insists on something the player might not expect from a creature this powerful, this ancient: formality. There are formalities, he explains, that must be observed at the first meeting of two of the Dovi. And the fact that he extends this courtesy, this ritual of equals, to a mortal standing before him says more about how Paarthurnax has come to regard humanity than almost anything else he could have stated directly. He does not address you as a lesser being seeking an audience with a god. He addresses you, by the old custom of his kind, as something closer to a peer. What follows is the demonstration the game frames as a kind of test, though it never feels punitive the way some trials in fiction do. Paarthurnax breathes fire upon the ancient word wall standing nearby, and a new word of power emerges from the stone, Yol, meaning fire, granted to the player not through combat, not through some arbitrary puzzle, but as a direct gift, freely given, from the dragon himself. A gift, Dovahkiin, he tells you. Yol. Understand fire as the Dov do. Now, show me what you can do. Greet me not as mortal, but as Dova. And when you shout that fire back at him, not in anger, not in challenge exactly, but in answer to his invitation, he accepts it, confirming what the Greybeards below have already told you, that the dragon blood runs strong in you, jaw though you may be, mortal though you remain. It's only after this exchange of formalities, only after this strange and oddly tender ritual of fire and recognition between an ancient dragon and a single mortal climber, that Paarthurnax finally agrees to answer your questions honestly. And the question you've climbed this entire mountain to ask, how to learn the dragon wren's shout, the weapon needed to fight Alduin all over again, receives, from him, not an immediate answer, but an admission of expectation. I was expecting this, he tells you, almost resigned, almost weary in a way that suggests he is known. This conversation was coming for longer than you have been alive. Alduin and Dovahkiin return together. He has been waiting, in other words, not simply meditating in some vague, undirected sense across all these centuries, but specifically watching, specifically waiting, for the exact moment when his brother's return would necessitate exactly this kind of visit, exactly this kind of question, from exactly this kind of mortal stranger climbing his mountain. In desperate need of an answer only he can provide. If you wander the summit a little further before this conversation is through, past the word wall, past the spot where Paarthurnax has landed, there's a small, easily overlooked object resting at the very peak of the mountain, an old, notched pickaxe, half buried in rock and snow. The game never explains it directly, never attaches a name or a story to whoever carried it up here long before you arrived. But its presence says something simple and quiet about this place, regardless. Someone else once climbed this same impossible distance, for reasons lost now to time, and left behind only this, a tool abandoned, at the single highest point in all of Tamriel. It's a small thing to notice in the middle of a conversation this momentous, but it's the kind of detail that gives the summit its weight. This isn't a stage built only for the player's arrival. It is a real place, with a real history that extends beyond the player's own story. However briefly, that history gets acknowledged. This recontextualizes everything about his solitude in a way worth sitting with. Paarthurnax was not simply hiding from the world, nor was he merely processing guilt in some endless, unproductive loop of private suffering. He was holding a vigil. Thousands of years of stillness, all of it oriented, in some sense, toward this exact moment, toward being present and ready when the inevitable finally arrived, when his brother returned and the world needed, once again, someone who remembered exactly how the first defeat had been accomplished. Whatever else his exile meant to him personally, it also functioned as a kind of preparedness, a readiness maintained across a span of time that should be functionally impossible for any consciousness to sustain without fraying. There's something worth noticing too, in how little ceremony surrounds this revelation when it actually arrives in dialogue. Paarthurnax doesn't frame his waiting as heroic. He doesn't present himself as a guardian who has nobly stood watch against an inevitable evil, awaiting his moment to rise and save the day. His tone, if anything, suggests something closer to fatigue, a being who has known for a very long time that this conversation was coming and has simply had to live day after day, century after century, with the knowledge that it hadn't arrived yet. That distinction matters enormously for how you understand the character. He is not a sentinel standing proud at his post, energized by purpose. He is something more weary than that, something that has simply continued existing, continued waiting, because the alternative, abandoning the vigil, leaving the mountain, pretending the inevitable might not come, was never something his nature would allow him to choose. It's also worth considering what this revelation does to the earlier image we built of his solitude as primarily an act of penance. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the game seems comfortable letting them coexist without forcing the player to choose one interpretation over the other. He withdrew from the world partly because of guilt over what he'd done, and he remained in that withdrawal partly because some part of him understood, with a clarity that only an immortal creature tracking the slow turning of ages could possess, that his brother's return was not a possibility to be dismissed, but an inevitability to be prepared for. Guilt and vigilance, in his case, occupied the same mountain, the same silence, the same thousands of years, reinforcing each other in ways that make his eventual willingness to help the player feel less like a sudden turn toward usefulness and more like the natural culmination of everything he had already been quietly doing, alone, for longer than anyone else alive could fully comprehend. Krosis, the tongue's mountain and the truth of Alduin. Before Paarthurnax will fully explain the path forward, the Elder Scroll needed, the time wound that must be accessed, the entire mechanism by which Dragonrend might be learned a second time. He insists on something that, on a first playthrough, might feel like an old man's digression, an unnecessary detour into history when the player simply wants directions toward defeating the world-ending threat currently bearing down on Skyrim. But you have indulged my weakness for speech long enough, he tells you eventually, almost apologetically, using a word, Krosis, meaning sorrow or regret, that recurs throughout his dialogue like a kind of verbal tick. A small linguistic admission of regret stitched into nearly everything he says, as though the word itself has become inseparable from however he experiences the act of speaking at all. And then he asks you directly whether you know why he lives here, at the peak of what the Dove call Monaven, what mortals have named the throat of the world. Most players, hearing this question for the first time, genuinely don't know the answer yet, and his response, true. But few now remember that this was the very spot where Alduin was defeated by the ancient tongues. Lands with real weight precisely because of everything we've already walked through in this story. The Dragon War, the Betrayal, the First Tongues, the battle fought with Dragonrend, and an Elder Scroll on this exact patch of stone where you are currently standing. Varukt Unslad, he says again. Perhaps none, but he now remembers how it truly happened. And there's something almost unbearably lonely embedded in that small phrase. The recognition that he may be the last living witness to the single most consequential battle in Skyrim's mythic history, and that even the Greybeards who revere him, even the Nords whose entire culture was shaped by the outcome of that day, have mostly lost the specific granular memory of what actually occurred, leaving him to carry it essentially alone. He corrects, gently but firmly, the assumption most mortals carry about that ancient victory. Viknus Nikron, he tells you. Yes and no. Alduin was not truly defeated that day. Not in the final, permanent sense the word implies, because if he had been, the World Eater would not now be returning to threaten the present. The tongues used Dragonrend to cripple him, yes, to strip away the unshakable confidence of his immortality long enough to create an opening, but the shout alone was insufficient. It took the Elder Scroll, the Kell, an artifact from outside the normal currents of time entirely, to actually cast Alduin away, not into death, but adrift, flung forward through the centuries to a future he wasn't meant to inhabit yet. Oke Mulag Unslad, Paarthurnax says of it, struggling, by his own admission, to translate the dragon concept fully into mortal language, because the Dove have words for such things that Jur simply do not possess. This explanation matters enormously, because it reframes the entire premise of the player's quest. You are not seeking to repeat a victory, you are seeking to actually finish something the First Tongues, for all their courage, for all the genuine sacrifice embedded in that ancient battle, were ultimately unable to complete themselves. The deferral they purchased, thousands of years of relative peace, has finally run its course, and the debt has come due again. This time, with no Elder Scroll readily available, to simply postpone it a second time, without first finding another way to access one. It's worth remembering, too, just how strange and arduous the search for that Elder Scroll actually turns out to be once Paarthurnax sets the player on the path toward finding one. Neither he nor the Greybeards know where to find such an artifact in the present day. The trail leads instead to the College of Winterhold, to Urag Gro Shub, the awesomer librarian who keeps the college's rarest texts, and through him to Septimus Cygnus, a former college scholar living in obsessive isolation in an ice cavern far to the north, by every account driven half-mad by decades spent studying the Elder Scrolls too closely. It's Septimus who finally points the way to Blackreach, a vast, forgotten Dwemer city sealed beneath the ice fields, reachable only through the ruins of Alftand and a long, dangerous descent past Falmer and ancient dwarven machinery still grinding away after thousands of years of neglect. The Elder Scroll, the player eventually retrieves to access the Time Wound, is not a convenient waiting prop. It is itself a forgotten thing, hidden as deeply in the world's neglected corners as Paarthurnax's own exile was hidden atop his mountain. And the parallel feels almost deliberate once you notice it. The means of finishing this ancient war had to be rediscovered twice over. Both the dragon who remembered how the first battle was fought and the artifact capable of repeating its outcome, each one waiting in isolation for someone determined enough to come looking. And it's here, in this same extended conversation atop the mountain, that the game allows Paarthurnax to address, with surprising directness for a creature so often wrapped in formal courtesy, the deeper truth about his own role in everything that's unfolded. He does not claim, even now, even when it might be tempting for a character in his position to soften his own history for a stranger he's trying to win cooperation from, that he was merely an instrument of Alduin's will during the Dragon War, blameless because he was simply following the orders of a more powerful dragon. He carries what he carries openly in front of you, and his willingness to teach you, to help you finish what he helped start so long ago, reads less like an attempt to erase that history and more like a continuation of the same impulse that drove him to teach the first tongues in the first place. The conviction, held now across an almost incomprehensible span of time, that what was wrong should be opposed, regardless of personal cost, regardless of whether the opposition ever fully balances the original wrong it's responding to. There is no moment in this entire exchange where Paarthurnax asks for forgiveness, explicitly. He doesn't perform contrition for your benefit, doesn't beg for absolution the way a more conventionally written redemption arc might require of its repentant villain. He simply continues doing the only thing he seems to believe he can do, teaching, helping, offering whatever knowledge a mortal climber needs to face the threat he himself once helped enforce and then chose, at tremendous cost, to oppose. It stands to reason that after this many centuries, Paarthurnax has stopped expecting forgiveness as an achievable outcome and has settled instead into something quieter and perhaps more honest, simply continuing to act rightly for as long as he continues to exist, without any particular hope that the accounting will ever fully balance. There's a particular kind of dignity in that posture, the dignity of someone who has given up on the idea of a final reckoning that resolves everything neatly and has chosen, instead, to simply keep doing the next right thing in front of him, day after day, without expecting credit for it. It would have been easy, in a story like this, to give Paarthurnax some grand climactic speech about redemption, some moment where he articulates exactly how he has earned the right to be forgiven for what he did during the Dragon War. The game never gives him that speech, and the absence is deliberate, or at least it reads that way, because a creature who genuinely understood the scale of his own past atrocities would likely never believe any speech could adequately settle the debt. He simply keeps teaching, keeps offering whatever he has, keeps existing patiently in the wind and cold, doing what good he can with the time that remains to him, however long that time turns out to be. He tells you before you leave that first meeting, where to find an Elder Scroll, directing you toward Arngir or toward Esbern of the Blades, both of whom will eventually point you toward the College of Winterhold. And he allows you to meditate upon the words of power you've learned from him, deepening your mastery of the voice in ways that will matter considerably once Alduin's return forces a direct confrontation. And then, for now, the conversation ends, and you descend the mountain again, carrying with you not just practical knowledge about Elder Scrolls and ancient shouts, but the much heavier, much more complicated understanding of exactly what kind of creature you've just spoken with. Not a wise old mentor in any simple sense, not a villain in any simple sense either, but something that exists genuinely outside those categories. A being who did terrible things and then spent longer than human civilization has existed trying, in his own quiet, patient way, to answer for them. The impossible choice, Delphine, Esbern and the Blades, everything that follows in the main quest, the discovery of the Elder Scroll, the journey back to the throat of the world, the time wound, the witness battle between the ancient tongues and Alduin, the learning of Dragonrend, the eventual confrontation with the World Eater himself. All of it builds toward a final reckoning between the player, the Blades, and Paarthurnax that the game frames, deliberately, as a moral choice, with no comfortable answer hiding inside it. The setup begins well before the player ever reaches that final decision point, seeded throughout the entire relationship with Delphine and Esbern, the last surviving members of the Blades, an ancient order founded specifically to hunt and destroy dragons. Their hostility toward Paarthurnax is established early and reinforced constantly. They wish him dead, not metaphorically, not as some abstract point of institutional policy, but specifically, personally, as a matter that both of them, once the immediate threat of Alduin has been dealt with, intend to press the player to resolve once and for all. It's worth understanding why, exactly, the Blades hold this position with such conviction, because the game does give them genuine reasoning, rather than simply painting them as unreasonably vindictive. From their perspective, shaped by an institutional memory stretching back through countless generations of dragon hunters, Paarthurnax remains, regardless of his current behavior, regardless of his centuries of apparent reform, a dragon who once served as Alduin's lieutenant during an age of genuine atrocity against mankind. The fact that he later turned against his own kind doesn't, in the Blade's calculus, erase the original sin of what he did before that turn. He has dragon blood on his claws from before his change of heart, and the Blade's entire purpose as an order is built on the principle that dragons, as a category, represent an existential danger to mortal freedom that cannot be safely tolerated regardless of individual exceptions. Paarthurnax, in their eyes, isn't a redeemed ally. He's a documented war criminal who happens to be currently useful, and usefulness to an order built on absolute principle is not the same thing as innocence. There is also, the game suggests, a more pragmatic dimension to their hostility, separate from pure moral principle. As part of rebuilding the Blades, an option open to the player after the main quest's central threats are resolved, Esbern and Delphine indicate that killing Paarthurnax would yield concrete benefits: reliable information about dragon locations, easier access to dragon souls, scales, and bones, resources the reconstituted Blades would find valuable in their ongoing mission. Their desire for his death is not purely abstract justice. It's tangled up with genuine institutional self-interest, a detail that complicates the morality of their position even further, because it means their insistence isn't simply about righteous vengeance for ancient crimes. It's also, at least in part, about removing an obstacle and gaining a strategic advantage. When this confrontation finally arrives in the game, it arrives with real weight, framed explicitly as the central remaining choice of the entire Paarthurnax storyline. The player can climb the mountain once more, can stand again before the dragon who taught them so much, who fought beside them in spirit, if not always in body, throughout the entire struggle against Alduin, and end his existence with a blow. The game even includes a distinct, almost ceremonial kill sequence for this exact moment, distinguishing it from a typical combat encounter, underscoring that the game itself understands this is not meant to feel like just another monster fight, or the player can refuse, can choose instead to walk away, to leave Paarthurnax exactly where he has remained for thousands of years, meditating in solitude above the clouds, and in doing so, can choose to permanently sever the relationship with Delphine and Esbern, who will not continue working with someone who has, in their eyes, sided with a dragon, over the order dedicated to opposing them. It's worth being honest about what each path actually costs the player going forward, because the consequences extend well past this single conversation on the mountain. Choosing to kill Paarthurnax opens the door to fully rebuilding the Blades as a functioning order again, restoring Skyhaven Temple to something resembling its former purpose, gaining access to ongoing quests, dragon hunting contracts, and the practical resources that come with an active, reconstituted faction. Choosing to spare him closes that door, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through quiet absence. Delphine and Esbern simply stop offering what they would otherwise have offered. The Blades remain a skeleton of two embittered survivors, rather than a revived institution, and the player loses access to an entire branch of the game's content built around that restored order. The choice, in other words, isn't simply moral, it's structural, woven into what kind of game experience the player gets to have afterward, and that practical weight makes the decision harder rather than easier, because it means walking away from Paarthurnax's death also means walking away from something tangible the game was prepared to offer in return for it. There is no third option that satisfies everyone. This is perhaps the single most honest thing about how the game handles this entire storyline. It does not offer some diplomatic resolution where Paarthurnax is exiled instead of killed, or where the Blades are somehow convinced to drop their demand without losing anything in the process. The game forces an actual choice, with actual permanent consequences, and refuses to pretend that either option is simply correct. If you side with the Blades and kill Paarthurnax, you gain practical advantages and the approval of an order with genuine historical legitimacy and genuine grievance. But you also end the existence of a creature who spent literally thousands of years trying, in whatever way was available to him, to answer for what he'd done before you ever met him. A creature who taught you, helped you, remained hospitable even knowing, by his own apparent foreknowledge, that this exact moment might eventually arrive. If you refuse, you preserve that hospitality. You honor whatever genuine change occurred in him across those centuries, but you do so at the cost of the Blade's trust and partnership. And you do so while implicitly accepting that his original crimes, whatever they specifically were, can be set aside in favor of who he chose to become afterward. The game does not tell you which choice is correct. It simply makes you stand on that mountain, in that same wind that has been blowing across that same stone for longer than any kingdom has stood, and decide for yourself whether thousands of years of apparent penance can ever fully answer for what came before it. Whether a being who did terrible things and then spent an almost incomprehensible span of time trying to do better deserves, finally, some kind of peace, or whether the weight of the original wrong is simply too heavy for any amount of subsequent time to lift. Anecdotally, among the community of people who discuss this choice online, sparing him seems to be the more commonly shared outcome, though no official figures exist to confirm whether that holds true across the entire player base. It's worth noting this only as a loose impression, rather than a verified statistic. Perhaps because the climb itself, the 7,000 steps, the wind and the silence and the slow accumulation of his story across every conversation builds a kind of intimacy with this strange, patient creature that makes it difficult to end his existence once you've actually heard him speak. Perhaps because something in his weariness, in that recurring word Krosis, in his admission that he was expecting this exact reckoning, suggests a being who has already, in some sense, made his peace with whatever the player ultimately chooses to do. It's worth considering too what it might mean that Paarthurnax never once, in any documented line of dialogue, asks the player to spare him. He doesn't plead his case. He doesn't enumerate his centuries of penance as evidence in his own defense, doesn't catalogue the lives he's helped or the knowledge he's freely given as a counterweight to the atrocities of his past. He simply waits, the same way he has waited atop that mountain for longer than recorded history, ready to accept whatever judgment finally arrives, whether it comes wrapped in mercy or in a blade. There's something almost unbearably dignified in that stillness. A creature who has had thousands of years to consider his own ending, and has apparently decided that pleading for his life would somehow cheapen whatever genuine change occurred in him across all that time. If the change was real, it doesn't need defending. If it wasn't, no defense would matter anyway. Either way, the choice belongs entirely to whoever climbs the mountain to make it, and Paarthurnax, true to the formal courtesy he extended at that very first meeting all those steps and shouts ago, seems determined to meet that judgment exactly as he met everything else across his long exile, without flinching, without complaint, and without asking the world for anything it isn't already inclined to give. Consider also the blade side of this one final time, because it would be too easy, having spent this much time inside Paarthurnax's perspective, to let Delphine and Esbern collapse into simple antagonists standing in the way of a peaceful ending. They are not wrong to remember what dragons did to mankind. They are not wrong that Paarthurnax's hands are not clean, regardless of how many centuries have passed since he last lifted them in violence against a mortal. Their order exists because someone, somewhere, has to remember the cost of forgetting what dragons are capable of. And there is a kind of grim wisdom in refusing to let an individual's apparent reform erase the weight of an entire species' history of subjugation. The tragedy of this final choice isn't that one side is righteous and the other is cruel. The tragedy is that both positions contain real moral weight, and the game refuses to let the player escape that discomfort by manufacturing a villain where none cleanly exists. It helps, too, to remember just how small the blades actually are by the time this choice arrives. This is not some vast, well-funded institution speaking from a position of comfortable authority. It is two people, Delphine and Esbern, survivors of an order that was hunted nearly to extinction, carrying the entire weight of their tradition's memory and grievance on their own two sets of shoulders. Their insistence on Paarthurnax's death isn't the policy of a distant bureaucracy. It's personal, born from years spent in hiding, from watching their order reduced to almost nothing by forces connected, however distantly, to the same draconic threat Paarthurnax once helped enforce. Understanding that smallness doesn't resolve the moral tension the choice presents, but it does make their position feel less like institutional cruelty and more like the hard-earned conviction of two people who have given everything they have to a cause they believe in, asking the player to finish something they themselves no longer have the strength left to finish alone. Either way, the mountain remains, the wind continues, and somewhere in the thin, cold air above the clouds, whether the player chooses to leave him there in peace or chooses instead to finally close the account that has remained open since the Dragon War first began, the story of Paarthurnax ends exactly where it has always been centered, on a single, ancient, complicated creature, sitting alone above the world, carrying the full weight of everything he was and everything he tried across thousands of patient years to become instead. There's a final thought worth leaving you with, something that lingers a little after the choice is made and the credits eventually roll. Paarthurnax's story isn't really about dragons at all. Not in the end, however much fire and wing and ancient prophecy surrounds it. It's about the specific, almost unbearable difficulty of trying to become someone different than what you were made or shaped to be, and whether that becoming, however genuine, however long sustained, can ever fully outweigh what came before it. Every culture that has ever told stories about redemption has wrestled with some version of this same question, and Skyrim, for all its dragons and words of power and apocalyptic prophecy, ultimately asks you to wrestle with it too, standing in the wind, looking at a creature who has had longer than any mortal civilization to think about the answer, and still, by every indication the game gives us, has not fully settled on one himself. Maybe that's the most honest thing the story offers. Not a verdict, not a clean resolution where guilt is either fully forgiven or fully punished. Just a mountain and a wind that has been blowing across it since long before anyone was alive to feel it, and a dragon who chose once, a very long time ago, to stop being what he was made to be, and who has spent every century since trying to discover whether that choice was enough. The 7,000 steps are still there if you ever want to climb them again, slowly, the way it was always meant to be done. The wall is still waiting, and somewhere above the clouds, the wind keeps moving across stone that has felt it for longer than memory can hold, patient in a way nothing mortal can truly imitate, content to simply continue, season after season, century after century, asking nothing of the travelers who come and go beneath it, except perhaps that they pause long enough at the top to actually listen. The tongues who remembered. There is one more thread worth pulling before we let this story rest, because Paarthurnax's tale doesn't end cleanly at the summit, and the lore the game scatters throughout Skyrim's libraries and ruins offers a few more fragments worth gathering by the fire before the night is through. The three tongues who fought beside the voice he gave them, Gormlith Golden-Hilt, Hakon One-Eye, and Feldir the Old, did not simply vanish from history once their battle with Alduin concluded. Their names persisted, woven into the earliest layers of Nordic legend, remembered not merely as warriors, but as the founding figures of an entire tradition of resistance that would eventually produce the Greybeards themselves, centuries downstream from the battle these three fought together. It's worth considering what it must have been like for them in the immediate aftermath of that victory, to carry the knowledge of what they had actually accomplished. They had not killed a god. They had bought time, nothing more, against a threat that even Paarthurnax himself, watching from this same mountain, understood was merely deferred rather than ended. One interpretation suggests that the first tongues understood this distinction clearly, that their triumph, however celebrated by the generations that followed, felt to them less like a victory and more like a debt successfully postponed, a burden they were quietly relieved to pass forward, to whoever might eventually have to finish what they started. The songs sung about them in later centuries rarely capture that nuance, preferring the simpler, more satisfying shape of heroes triumphant, rather than heroes who understood with some clarity that their work remained unfinished. This is perhaps the quiet kinship between Paarthurnax and those three ancient tongues he taught so long ago, a kinship that outlasted their mortal lives by thousands of years. All of them, in their own ways, carried the same understanding, that the battle on this mountain was not an ending. It was a beginning, paid for in advance, against a reckoning that someone, someday, would have to face again. Paarthurnax simply happened to be the one among them whose nature allowed him to live long enough to be standing here, still waiting, when that reckoning finally arrived. There's a particular stillness in imagining the mountain now, after everything has been said, after the player has made whatever choice they were going to make and descended once more toward the green valleys and crowded halls of the world below. The wind doesn't pause to mark the occasion. The snow doesn't fall any differently, whether Paarthurnax still sits at the summit, or whether his ashes have long since scattered into the same currents that carried Alduin forward through the centuries. The mountain simply continues being a mountain, indifferent in the way that ancient, patient things are always indifferent to the brief dramas that play out across their slopes. And there is something almost comforting in that indifference, a reminder that the largest, oldest things in this world rarely concern themselves with verdicts at all. They simply endure, and let the endurance itself become its own kind of answer. Think, too, of all the travelers who will climb those 7,000 steps after you, generation after generation of adventurers and pilgrims and curious wanderers, each of them arriving at the same word wall, each of them hearing some version of the same greeting, each of them forced to sit, even briefly, with the same impossible weight of deciding what an ancient wrong is worth and whether time alone can ever discharge it. The mountain will keep asking that question long after any single traveler has found their own answer and moved on. And that too feels like part of what Paarthurnax's story is actually about. Not a single resolution, reached once and then closed forever, but a question renewed with every new set of footsteps that finds its way up that long, cold, windswept path toward the silence at the top of the world.